Hi everyone, and welcome to 164 Diecast. In early 1968, I had just turned 12 years old. I was like any other kid in the middle 60s would be at that age. I was getting ready for junior high school, riding my newly acquired Schwinn orange crate that I bought with the proceeds from my paper route, waiting for the Helms bakery truck to bring sweet-smelling donuts, drinking Pepsi from a glass bottle that you made sure to save so you could get a dime for it, listening to Dodger games on the radio because they weren't on TV much back then, discovering the wonders of girls, and sitting behind the wheel of my dad's shiny black GTO with the Krager mag wheels and red sidewall tires. It wasn't too hard to figure out that the Batmobile on TV had been created from a GTO. I couldn't wait for school to get out that summer. It was close, and summer meant the beach, and hanging out with my buddies for a game of marbles. And I had my secret weapon, a deep blue Perry and a cat's eye boulder. My collection would be growing that summer. What I didn't know, however, was something was about to change. Something that would become a part of the rest of my life, just as it would for millions of others around the world. On May 18th, 1968, a toy appeared. A car, to be specific, a very small car. Encased in plastic on a card with a round metal badge. On the top of that card were the words, Hot Wheels. The car was a blue Custom Camaro. It was the first, and 15 more followed in 1968, with many more over the years to come. Mattel was not the first toy company to make a small 1/64 scale metal toy car. Several companies have been doing this for many years. The British toy company Leslie Products have been making Matchbox cars for a long time, and was probably the leading maker of small diecast cars. Prior to May 18, 1968, Mattel was a small toy manufacturer that was best known for their Barbie dolls for young girls. The company was owned by Elliot and Ruth Handler. Barbie had been designed by Ruth and an engineer named Jack Ryan. The doll had been named after Ruth's daughter. One day, Elliot was watching his grandchildren playing with Matchbox cars in his living room and noted they didn't roll very well on the floor. The kids simply just couldn't roll them across the floor. They were really just meant to be looked at. Elliot thought they should roll fast. So he came up with the idea of a car the same size that could be played with by kids and raced on a track. He brought the idea up to his team at Mattel, and they didn't like it. The market was too saturated with other small toy cars, they said. They were right, but they were also wrong. What Elliot had in mind was different. In the 1960s, Americans had fallen in love with their cars. Automakers took note, and a golden age of automotive history took shape. People already had the 57 Chevy, the Nomad, the T-Bird, the Corvette. When Ford introduced the Mustang in 1964, the public now had an inexpensive sporty car to drive. GM responded. The Camaro, Firebird, and GTO came on the scene. Ford continued making other muscle cars as well, and Dodge responded with the Charger and Challenger. It was a great time to be a car owner. Aftermarket wheel maker Krager made mag wheels, and tire makers like Goodyear added red coloring to their white wall tires. But there weren't small toy cars to reflect what the public was driving. Not yet. And that was what Elliot Handler saw. But he also wanted them to be fast, so you could race them. He hired a guy by the name of Harry Bentley Bradley. Bradley had designed concept cars for GM and was the designer of the Dodge Diora. Handler added Barbie co-designer Jack Ryan to the Hot Wheels team along with other creative talent. The Automobile Club publication Your AAA Today, found here, tells us this. The company was known for hiring the best and brightest, regardless of sex, race, religion, or background. In this sense, it was an outlier in the mid-1900s. But a diverse workforce brought new ideas and fresh perspectives, which is precisely what would be needed if the toy maker wanted to create a product the world had never seen. It also tells us that these new toy cars were to be debuted at the 1968 New York Toy Fair. But prior to that, in order to try and get a head start on retail orders, Elliott Handler invited an executive from Kmart to see the cars in track. When Handler had the car roar down the track at high speed and roll across the room, the executive placed an order for $50 million right on the spot. The rest, as they say, is history. In 1998, Mattel celebrated the 30th anniversary of Hot Wheels and released a 4-car collector set called, obviously, 30th Anniversary Hot Wheels Cars. This is the set we are looking at today. The 4 cars of this set recreate 4 of the Hot Wheels cars released as part of the 1970 Spoiler series, which were themselves recreations of the original Sweet 16. These 4 are updated and modified with oversized blown engines. They are recreated in some of the original Spectraflame paint schemes and are as follows: a red Nitty Gritty Kitty, gold Heavy Chevy, a blue King Cuda, and a green Light My Firebird. Each of these particular castings are first-run toolings. The Mattel product number for this set is 19322. The corresponding original Sweet 16 castings are Custom Cougar, Custom Camaro, the very first Hot Wheels car, Custom Barracuda, and Custom Firebird. What made the original Hot Wheels cars so fast, and what made them an instant and lasting hit, were the wheels and bearing setup. Originally, Mattel used metal mandolin strings as axles and a new DuPont plastic material called Delrin as bearings. Mated to hard plastic mag wheels with red sidewalls, they not only moved fast, they looked fast. The original setup had some issues with reliability, so over time the wheel and axle setup has changed and improved. The cars were sold for $1, and over the last 50 plus years have mostly maintained that price point. Although these toy cars have changed over the years, and today the early cars can command high prices, one thing hasn't changed. Both young and old still play with, collect, and value these amazing tiny cars. You can read more about the history of Hot Wheels at these websites. And read about the cars in this Hot Wheels set here. I hope you enjoyed this look back at the beginnings of the coolest 1/64 scale cars in the world. And thank you for visiting 1/64 Diecast. And we will see you on the next video.